Everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and our topic today is why don't we take Shevuot today? We have this amazing Masechet that tells us all about Shevuot, including the danger of Shevuot, but certainly the use of Shevuot, especially in court. Where are they? We don't do it. So I want us to look at when that started, why we don't do it, and what we do instead. So it may surprise people to know that this practice of not taking a shvua in court seems to go back all the way to the Geonim. And when I say the Geonim, I mean that the Geonim period, it's really between, I don't know, let's say 7th century and 10th century. That's really early. And it's quoted that this was the Gaonic practice not to take Shevuot, and that is continued in the Rishonim's time, sort of in the what do we say, like from 1,000 and on, we call it the Rishonim's time. So let's take a look at how this came to be. So first of all, we know from our Gemara in Shevuot, we know how bad it is to swear a false oath, right? We saw the iyum, the threat against those who are going to make an oath. They say to them is on Shevuot, the bottom of Lamed Chet Amud Bet, to the top of Lamed Tet Amud Aleph. Omrim lo hevi yodea shekol ha'olam kulo nizdaza b'shah shamar kadosh baruch hu b'Sinai lo tisat shem Hashem lokecha lashav. They say you should know that the whole world trembled when God said you shouldn't take God's name in vain at Sinai, and b'chol avirot shebatorah ne'emar b'hem v'nakei, and all of the sins in the Torah, based on the Yud Gimel Midot, or the way we read the Yud Gimel Midot, is that God will cleanse those. B'chan ne'emar lo yinakei, but when it comes to lo tisat shem Hashem elokecha lashav, we actually say, the Torah actually says that God will not cleanse a person. And every person, every sin that a person does, usually they're punished, but now it's going to be even their families punished if they take a false oath with God's name. Quoting Kohelet, you shouldn't let your mouth cause guilt to bisarecha, not here literally your flesh, but in bisaro el krovo, your family member. How do we know that? Right? From Yeshayahu, you should not hide yourself from your flesh, which means from your family. And lastly, and all sins in the Torah, a person themselves again gets punished, but here the whole world gets punished. And there's a citation from the pasuk in Hosea, Shneimar, as it says, "Alo b'chachesh," if some swearing and lying, and then it goes on to other things that are more obviously problematic, or more obviously incredibly severe, I should say, murder, stealing, adultery, etc. And the next pasuk says, "Everyone who dwells in the world will languish because of these activities." So clearly, a shvua has the possibility of breaking the world. And so it should surprise us that we find Rashi and the Gemara in Shevuot telling us, "Uvidorotenu bitlu rishonim Shevuot deoraita." In our generations, the early decisors have nullified the practice of taking at least a biblical Shevuah, lefi she'onsha gadol, because the punishment for it is great. V'tiknu lagzor alav arur basara. Instead, what they do is they will proclaim a curse in case you're lying in front of a quorum of 10. And v'ha'amran arur bo shvuah, we know from the Gemara in Shevuot that the word arur, the word curse, contains and can have the connotation of a shvuah, of an oath. So that's the way we get around it. So it sounds like we're limiting, at least we don't take biblical shvuot, and we have something in its place that is serious, certainly serious. The Ravid says a little bit more. He says, Amar Avram, Shamati shetiknu geonim. He says, I take this back to the geonim. She'ein mashbi'in achshav lo b'shem v'lo b'kinoi. We don't do any shvuot with God's name or with any, label for God that isn't technically God's name. Why? Kidei shelo yehei ha'olam charev al yedei hachotim sherabu, so that the world will not be destroyed because of the many sinners, meaning we have a sense, or he said the Geonim had a sense that people just didn't fear God in that way. There were too many people who didn't fear God in that way, who would lie under oath, and therefore no more. Instead, what we do is we threaten with excommunication if they're lying about their claim, and curses, and excommunication threats with the official, with the official trumpeting announcement, and kibui nerot, and turning out the lights, umitot kfuyot, and turning over the beds, right, like a mourning symbol, la'ayem alav, in order to threaten this person, to intimidate this person, that person should know that if they are lying with their claim, they are only hurting themselves. So clearly we see there is a problem with people who are liars. And because there are too many liars, we're not having anybody take a Shevuot. But Rabbi Yehuda ben Shmuel HaChassid in 12th century Germany has a very interesting discussion. Now, he is a pietist, which means you have to imagine that the circles that he is talking to are people who are going to be a little bit more, shall we say, hardcore, right? So they're a little bit ascetic, they're certainly very mystical. And in this case, the discussion that he has is about a Jew who is being forced to take an oath to a non-Jew. There is clearly some sort of din between the two of them. The non-Jew seems to owe the Jew money, but won't give the Jew that money without the Jew taking an oath. And now this Jew wants to know, or Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is describing the situation of what would happen here if the Jew is telling the truth, should he take the Shevuah. So Yehudi Achad haya mechuyav shvuah legoy amar ma'aseh. Jew had an obligation to take an oath to a non-Jew, which I do, right? And there's no possibility of affirming the way we do in court today. And he says, if I do take the honest oath, and it's an honest oath, and I end up getting my money back because I'm able to take this honest shvuah, this true shvuah, I'll give half of it to tzedakah even. I'll give half of it to charity. Amar Misha Amar, people have said, mutav shetishava be'emet, that maybe it's a good idea that you take the shvuah because you'll get your money back. You give half of it to tzedakah. But the sage said, nope. Afilu im titin kulo l'tzedakah, even if you give all of it to tzedakah. Umishalcha od tosif l'tzedakah, and you add more of your own to tzedakah. Mutav shelo titen tzedakah v'lo tishava afilu be'emet. Better that you don't give tzedakah and that you don't do any oath, even if it's true. Why? Ki kama krachim nechrlu avur shvuat emet. Because there were some cities that were destroyed because of a true oath. Lakach yizaher adam shelo yaseh im hagoy ve'im hayudi al bifnei edim. Therefore, what you should do is make sure all of your transactions from now on have two witnesses there, whether you're dealing with a Jew or you're dealing with a non-Jew, so that you will not have to take an oath, and instead you can just have witnesses come and say what happened. Now, this is something else entirely. It's not, we're afraid that people are liars, and since you're not lying, or we're afraid that people are liars, and, you still shouldn't do it because in general we don't do this. It's actually, even on a Shevuot emet, even on a true Shevuah, there have been cities that have been destroyed. Now, what is Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid referring to? I will tell you what he's referring to. He's referring to, at least where I found it, is in Bamidbar Rabbah, Midrash in Bamidbar Rabbah, and the Midrash in Bamidbar Rabbah quotes a pasuk in Devarim, and that pasuk in Devarim tells us, and it's at we'll read it, at Hashem Elokecha Tira, fear God, meaning fear only God, V'oto ta'avod, and you should worship God, Ubishmo tishavea, you should only swear in God's name, right? Now it's interesting. The Midrash says, Im yesh b'cha kol hamidot ha'elu, if you have all of these midot, meaning you fear God and you worship God, then אתה רשאי להישבע. Then you're allowed to take an oath. ואם לאו, אין אתה רשאי להישבע. If you don't, then you can't. So maybe there's something about, are you trying to say that you are so great that you fear God? But it gets better. Ma'aseh biyanai hamelech. Something happened with King Yanai, and let's remember who King Yanai is. King Yanai is a Hasmonean king. The rabbis do not like King Yanai because he's not supposed to be a king. He's not from Malchut Beit David. He's not supposed to be a king. Um, but what happens with, and not only that, he persecutes the Prushim, but his wife, Shlom Tzion HaMalka, people like a lot because she protects the Prushim, and her brother-in-law is Shimon ben Shetach. But we'll get to that some other time. So something happened with Yanai HaMelech. שהיו לו 2,000 עיירות, he had 2,000 cities, וכולם נחרבו על שבועת אמת. And all of them were destroyed because of a true oath. כיצד? What? How so? אומר אדם לחברו בשבוע שאני הולך ואוכל כך וכך במקום פלוני. People would say to each other, taking an oath, I'm going to eat such and such and such and such place. ואשתה וכך במקום פלוני, and I'm going to drink such and such place. והיו הולכין ומקיימין שבועתן, and they would go and do what they actually said in their shvuah. Now notice these are not courtroom shvuahs. These are like people just casually taking a shvuah to go do something. Why would you do such a thing? That's a very strange thing to do. V'nechrevu, and these cities were destroyed. מה הנשבע באמת כך? הנשבע על השקר על אחת כמה וכמה. How much more so if these cities were destroyed for people taking a shvuah and following through on them, how much more so would cities would people who are lying about their shvuah, would that be a problem? Now, this is a really interesting example because it's not a courtroom. It actually sounds like they're being a little willy-nilly by just taking a shvuah with Shem Hashem all the time. That's not really what they should be doing. It doesn't really sound like this is kind of a courtroom situation. Now, don't get me wrong, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid's example, it's not clear to me what courtroom these people are in. It sounds like it's actually a private thing. It's kind of a personal thing. I don't really know. But would you necessarily say the same about people who are taking an oath in a court as you would as people who say, I'm taking an oath because I'm, going to such and such place? I'm not really sure. But what I will say is that there's Yerushalmi that I think might give a little bit of a different color to the idea of even a Shvuat Emet can get you into trouble and can cause problems. And not just maybe you're using it too much, or not just you're not enough of a Yerei Shamayim, so you shouldn't be allowed to take a Shvuah, and not just, well, we're trying to keep the people who would lie out. But there might be a situation where you're taking a Shvuat Emet where you are being honest, but you're missing some information, kind of, Yaakov and Lavan style, where Yaakov doesn't realize that Rachel has Lavan's idols and essentially condemns her to death because he doesn't know, right? He says, I didn't steal it. He doesn't know. So here it goes in the Yerushalmi and Shevuot. Bo u're'eh, come and see. Dvarim she'ein ha'esh sorfan, shvuat shav mechalatan. Things that even fire can't destroy, a false oath can destroy. Rabbi Yonah Amar al sheker. So Rabbi Yonah says, well, let me just be clear. It means when we say shvuat shav here, what we mean is somebody who is like purposely taking a shvuah to lie. Rabbi Yossi Amar afal haemet. Rabbi Yossi says, no. It could just be a vain shvuah that's honest. What do we mean by this? Chagai darish kehada de Rabbi Yossi. So Chagai gave us an example. Uvda haba b'chada ita. It happened with a woman. Da'azlat me'aroch gav chaverta. She went to knead dough at her friend's house. Vahava katir b'shite de kulsita. And what was kashur, what was, what's the word, knotted or tied into her head covering was train dinarim. She had like 2 dinarim sewn into her head covering, right? So I want you to imagine people are kneading dough. You're pushing, it's hard, you're moving, you're not. And of course, naflula, The two dinarim fall, v'yarchu gavigula, and they end up inside the dough, but they don't realize it. Okay? Hafacht bayalahu gav beta velo ashkachton. And this woman later, she's at her own house, and she's like, "Where are my dinarim? I don't know where my dinarim are." So Chazra Lagaba, she goes back to her friend's house, Amrla, and she says, Havli train dinarim, dinafoli gav beitech. Give me back my two dinarim that clearly fell in your house. Amrla, and the woman says, Lo yadana, right? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't I don't take your dinarim because she doesn't know that it fell in the dough either. And then this really is like a Yaakov moment. Iyadabahu tikbor bara says, if I know, and she uses third person euphemistically, if I know and have them, my child should be buried. And guess what? Kvarte, her child died. Mi alun mi kivrei, when they were uh going up from the kever, shamat kala amra, she heard a voice saying, Ilay dahavat yada bahon lo kavarte. Had you not known, you wouldn't have had to bury your son, meaning you obviously knew, right? Or had she not known, she wouldn't have had to bury her son. She obviously knew. But to be honest, maybe she really didn't know, right? Amra, in Yada Bahon, he ita tikbor bracharana. She said, what are you talking about? I don't know. If I know, and again, third person, if I know, I should bury my other child. And sadly, Kvarte, she did. Her other son died. Alun menachamta, right? It's unbelievable. People come to give this woman comfort. The cuts on chad eagle, and what do? They cut open bread to eat with her, right? As Sudat Havra when she's coming back from burying her dead. Va'ashkachon train dinaraya arichin gavigula, and they found the two dinarim inside of the loaf. Hada milta amra. This is what is meant by what people say, ben zakai ben chayav l'shvuot loteo. Whether for any reason you should not be taking oaths. Now, this is an interesting example because this woman really was telling the truth. She really didn't know. And yet the force of her words, right? They're thinking about the force of words used with Shem Hashem. The force of her words ended up causing calamity. So this might be another, and of course it's not clear. Did she know? Did she not know? She's swearing that she didn't know, right? But this is all supposed to be a drasha on what Rabbi Yossi says, that it's al ha'emet even, right? So kind of an interesting example of the blurriness between truth and falsehood, the question of do you know everything that you need to know? But suffice it to say, we have three reasons at least for their for not wanting to take a shvua, even if it's in our courtrooms, right? So I want to look before we end at what we do instead. So the suggestion that's made is that instead of having a party take a shvua, either to not have to pay or to be able to take the money that they're claimed they owed, what we do is a pshara. We do some sort of settlement, but people say, or some people say pshara krova ladin, that you should do a pshara that's pretty close to what the law itself would have been, and basing themselves on Rabbi Yaakov Reisher from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, excuse me, 17th, 18th century. He says, Al kol panim lo yiftor zeh shemitchayev bedin b'chol hashlosh meot. He's talking about a particular situation where a defendant is required to pay 300. Lo yiftor oto yoter mishlish shehu mea. You shouldn't, exempt if you're trying to do a pshara that's krova ladin, if you're trying to do a compromise that's close to what or if you're trying to do a pshara, you're trying to do a settlement. I want it to be krova ladin. I want it to be not, don't deviate from what he should pay more than a third, meaning more than 100, right? He should at least have to pay two-thirds of what he would have had to pay without the shvuah. right? At least that's the way we would apply it if we're talking about doing a pshara krov ladin. Shizeh mikre karov ladin, right? Because that's a pshara that's krov ladin, right? So that it seems to be in a lot of the literature, there's a discussion of what we do is instead we do pshara, right? Instead of having people take the Shevuot to get what they get or to not have to um, give, we do a pshara. And we do a pshara that's krovaladin. We do a pshara that's up to a third of a deviation from what's supposed to be. But Rabbi Shlomo Levi, it's already 35 years ago, he's very concerned about this. He says, "אחד האתגרים החשובים ביותר העומדים לפנינו הוא השבת כבוד התורה ודינה." One of the things that we need to be able to do is restore the glory of Torah. והקמת מערכת בתי דין לדיני ממונות שישמשו כתובת לכל דורש צדק ומשפט. He wants the Batei Din he wants batei din for financial matters to be an address where people who are really looking for justice are going to go. לצורך זה, for this reason, עלינו להקים מערכת שתיתן הפתרונות הנכונים על פי דין. He said we have to have a judicial system that's going to work based on what the law is. והמשרתים את צורכי הציבור הפונה לבית דין, and those who are serving the needs of the community who are coming to the beit din, כך שאנשים יעדיפו את בתי הדין על פני בתי המשפט האזרחיים. We want people to be willing to come to beit din and not go to secular courts. We want them to come to us. And his worry is, לעניות דעתי, he says, הנוהג לחייב פשרה בכל מקרה של שבועה. He says the idea of enforcing a settlement, enforcing a compromise, in every situation where Shevuot would have been warranted, hein d'oraita, hein d'rabanan, whether it was a biblical Shevuot or a rabbinic Shevuot. Lo zabuvat she'enu mevusas dayo mibchina halachitית. He says, first of all, it's not just that it isn't founded enough in halachic literature, ella shehu, meaning it's not grounded in halakha, ella shehu gam enu mishareit matarazo. It also doesn't help us with this goal of getting people to want to come to Beit Din. Ba'alei din, litigants, af im b'tuchim heim shadin imam, even if they think that they're right, yimanu milihitayen b'makom sheitachen sheichfu alehem levater al shlish me'aschum hamagia lehem al pi din. They're not going to go to a court that's going to make them give up on a third of their claim if they think their claim is right. They're not going to go to the courts. So he's very concerned about that. Now, I want to point out, I'm not, I haven't spent time in Batei Din, so I'm getting this from what I'm learning and what I'm reading. But it is interesting to note that Rav Moshe Feinstein, he actually wrote, he says, uh, um, that he thinks this idea of automatically doing a pshara up to a third is a problem, and he has a different suggestions. He says, כמדומני שנוהגים לפשר בניכוי שליש בעד שבועה בין נפטר בין נוטל. I think that what we do is a compromise. People do a compromise, by taking off a third of the required payment instead of a shvua, whether it's a shvua for somebody not to have to pay more or not to have to pay, like the defendant taking a shvua not to have to pay, or it's the plaintiff taking a shvua to be able to take, right? Instead of doing that, we do nikui, we minimize it by a third. He says, Aval kivan she'en lezeh makor gadol migamar poskim harishonim. He says, but since this is not really founded in the Gemara in a serious way or in the earlier decisors, ein ze inyan muchlat. I don't think this is absolute. Instead, v'hakol lefi ra'ot einei hadayan. I want this to all follow what the judge thinks, meaning ki lefamim nikar she'eno rotze lishava mishum shu sheker. Sometimes you can see that a litigant isn't going to take an oath because they're lying. ובזה צריך לפשר ליתן יותר, right? And in that situation, what the judge should do is should say the defendant actually has to pay more, meaning if the judge can tell that there's a lie here. ולפעמים ניכר שהתובע מאמין לנתבע, and sometimes you can see that the plaintiff actually trusts and believes the defendant, ach rotzeh latil alav shvua, but they still want to say, you defendant, you have to take a shvua, meaning the plaintiff wants the defendant to take a shvua, mipnei sheyodea shelo yishava v'yitratzeh litpasher, because they know that the defendant wouldn't want to take a shvua and will want to do a settlement, and so it works to the advantage of the plaintiff. Kazeh yesh lefasher litain pachot, right? He says, well, in that case, we also shouldn't, you shouldn't allow up to a third. You should actually do less, right? Meaning you have to see who you actually trust in this situation. The judge has to see who they trust in the situation. It shouldn't just always be, okay, it's a compromise of a settlement of a third. Lachein talui be'enei hadayan. It is therefore based on what the judge thinks. Ach im lo nikar klum, he says, but if you can't tell at all, kim dumani sheno agin binikui shlish ba'ad shvua be'niftar be'notel. And if you can't tell, so use a third as your k'nei midah. Right? So it's kind of an interesting, it kind of takes us back to why you don't take a shvua, right? We don't want you to take a shvua even though you're honest. We don't want you to take a shvua because you're lying. But Hadron Alach Masechet Shevuot, Hadra Halan. Congrats, everybody. Mazel tov.